Mike Gibson, Ajay Kirtane coming to you live from day 2 of TCT virtual. And Ajay, I thought it was a really, really great session this afternoon for the coronaries. Talked a little bit about the high points.
Yeah, I think today was definitely revenge of the coronaries. I think many
Yeah.
people have felt for some time that we see more and more structural heart disease at TCT. That's where the action is. That's where the investments are. That's where we can save lives. But yet today, I think personally, the late-breaking clinical trials science section in some ways, got a little bit ahead of the structural session. So 4 things were presented. I think the first one, Disrupt CAD, was highly anticipated. The observational study of the shockwave balloon. This is sort of a technology that everybody can use. It's a balloon-based technology for coronary calcification. It met its primary endpoints. We think that this will ultimately allow it to go for FDA approval, but that obviously remains to be seen. But definitely offers a strategy out there for people who may be more reticent to use atherectomy. And you're pointing to yourself, Mike.
I'm one of those, you know me in downstream embolization. So my agreement with Dr. Pinto was I would be doing a lot more of this on calcified lesions. I've used it a couple of times and I was actually very impressed with the results. So for someone who's like me, who's worried about downstream embolization, I think this is going to be a great solution.
I think Dean Kariakis in his interview definitely pointed out that this is just another tool, and the two tools may be complementary, especially if you can't get to the lesion. But
Right.
I'm the type of person who likes to have more tools because then I can figure out which tools to use for which patient. So that was pretty
I'm
exciting
the kind
to
of guy
me.
who likes to perfect the one. I grew up at the VA, so very cost effective, very cost efficient. So I like to perfect my tools. So I'm excited to have this one though. That's great.
Yeah.
What?
Other studies that were presented, Dr. Moran and Roxana presented the results of the Science 28 and 90, looking at outcomes associated with shorter DAP durations and higher bleeding risk patients. Trial met its primary endpoints, or the observational study met its primary endpoints. So now this is another stent, another drug-eluting stent that has demonstrated safety profiles that are quite good with earlier discontinuation of DAP. She was also circumspect and said that, look, for certain patients, you're going to want to continue your DAP. But I am a clinician that likes to have options, as I said, and so it's great to have that option for those patients who may have to come off of DAP early. The caveats were not all complex lesions, didn't include STEMIs, so we have to be a little bit cautious about it, but also certainly good news for the DES world.
Yeah, that's just like Twilight where we didn't have STEMIs. So we have a lot of data on these types of lesions and early discontinuation. I think the evidence, when you look at the totality of evidence, it's really kind of coming together to say that this probably obviously reduces bleeding, but obviously also we were worried about the ischemic events, but it looks like there's not a real penalty, when you look at the totality of the data. But you're right, Ajay, this is not applied to STEMI. Although at this meeting, we saw the Tycho STEMI sub-study. So in those patients, it looked like an earlier or shorter course of ticagrelor was okay.
Yeah, the thing is if you look at it from a historical perspective, right after I finished my fellowship was when the FDA convened the panel looking at longer durations of DAPT, and this is when there was a lot of concern for late stent thrombosis with DES. Things were extended to a year, largely because I think people were just worried and they didn't know how these events were going to occur, how often they would occur. You remember the Forbes headline, ticking time bombs, these DES. But at that time, it was on the basis of observational data that showed that if you continued, you did better than if you didn't. But we all know those two patient populations are very different. So for me personally, it's kind of fulfilling to see this all come back full circle because, I personally was involved in some of the trials with other stents looking at shorter duration DAP. And it's nice to at least know that we have flexibility and that patients are going to do okay if they have to come off their DAP for bleeding reasons.
Yeah, I got a little concerned the other day when we had someone with aspirin sensitivity, and the fellow said, "Oh, yeah, no, they don't need aspirin. Mike said it was okay just to give ticagrelor in Twilight," and I'm like, "Whoa, whoa, 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 whoa!
Yeah.
That's not the method. People still need aspirin for their PCI, but the duration of the aspirin is really getting telescoped shorter and shorter."
Totally, and just there are other solutions for patients like that. I think the other 2 studies that were
But Ajay, one
important.
last word just to the audience is you and I aren't saying short depth for everybody. I mean, you and I are saying in an individual patient, you have to decide, you have to balance the risk of bleeding and the risk of an ischemic event. It's a patient by patient choice.
100% agree. The last two studies in that session were looking at imaging and physiology. There's been a lot of that at this meeting. Actually, if you look at the live cases, all 3 live cases that have been done thus far, coronary cases, in CHIP sessions involved the use of imaging and physiology in the one yesterday, which I think illustrates the point that if you're going to do complex PCI or CHIP type cases, there are certain devices that have been promulgated as the sort of be all and end all of these complex cases. And those are actually probably used in a small fragment of cases. But imaging is really ascendant. And I think, honestly, has data now with the ultimate 3-year results showing that IVUS guidance was actually associated with improved outcomes out to 3 years. And then Defined PCI, who, as you know well, Alan Jeremias, my co-fellow, and you trained him too,
Yeah.
presented, his group with Manesh Patel presented 1-year results of Defined PCI, showing that there are patients that have abnormal physiology post-PCI, often unrecognized, and those folks have worse quality of life outcomes typically than those that have normal physiology, which sets the stage for a randomized trial, which will be launching soon, called Defined GPS, which will look at a strategy of treating the physiology pre and post PCI versus the conventional approach. So a lot of excitement in the imaging and physiology world. And we were talking before, Mike, you were saying, I think you're convinced now too, that you're going to have to start using it more frequently, huh?
You know, Ajay, you've known me a long time, and I've always been a big fan of direct stenting and just getting in and out as quick as I can. My whole philosophy of, when you're robbing a bank, you don't stay in the bank very long. So, the young guys in the lab have really beaten me up a lot and said, no, 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 you gotta do OCT. So we're not doing IVUS, we're doing a lot of OCT. So they beat me up so much that I'd say in the majority of our cases now, I'm doing OCT. I'm learning a lot about that. And I was just joking earlier with some of the guys, like, oh my God, now after OCT, now I'm going to have to do, am I going to have to do FFR as well? What used to be a 10-minute case for me, just putting a stent in, is going to take 30 minutes now. But I think we have to think about the patients. And certainly what the IVUS study shows, 3-year durable outcomes are improved with imaging. Although I have to say, it seemed to me that the curves really separated early at the 1-year time point. It was a durable benefit out to 3 years. But nonetheless, it looks like it is an improvement in outcomes, although, Ajay, to be fair, a lot of those improvements were in target vessel revascularization.
Yeah, I fully agree. But that's something a patient doesn't want to have to do. They don't want you to have to come back twice. So you're sounding an awful lot like a reformed bank robber now, Mike. So maybe they'll let you vote.
They may let me vote now. The young guys are making me use a lot more new tools. So it's
Yeah.
actually good. Ajay, there was also the structural sessions this morning. I gotta say, kind of disappointing, to be real honest. Talk to us a little bit about some of those studies.
I'll take you through them pretty quickly. 3 basically negative trials, Accurate Neo versus the core valve. Now remember though, it's important to remember that this is the earlier device. This is not the Neo 2 device, and even the core valve was a little bit earlier as well, but Accurate Neo failed to meet non-inferiority compared to core valve in that trial, but I think we need more data because it was an earlier device for
It
sure.
was early and small, but on the other hand, Ajay, there were more deaths. And talking with some of the other folks behind the scenes, I thought, and when I did my live wrap up with some of the guys earlier, we thought it was due to the greater AI, but talking to some other people now, it's become clear that it may have been due to more procedural deaths, in-lab deaths, or immediately after the lab. So you're right, it was an early generation. We'll have to see where things go from there.
For sure. Then Mithras, which was an interesting trial after transcatheter mitral valve repair, 95% MitraClip. If you have a persistent ASD with a QPQS that's elevated, should you close the ASD? And the answer is you should not be doing it routinely because there really weren't any differences. And there may be a subset of patients, those with large shunts perhaps, that could benefit. But
Right.
remember also that for some of these patients currently, ASD or creating a communication between the LA and the RA is being investigated as a therapy for heart failure. So there's
I
potentially
know.
a reason to keep it open.
I know. So, we're doing that trial at Bain. So it's kind of funny, it can be a benefit maybe in heart failure patients, but Pat O'Gara made a good point when we were talking live, was that, look, we used to put two sheaths in for two balloons to do the mitral cases and didn't close those, and the patients did okay. So, but you're right, Ajay, there may be some bigger shunts that may benefit.
And then finally, embolic protection, which has been a big issue. This was a trial, the REFLECT-2 study presented by Jeff Moses, who frankly I think did a great job of presenting what was a quite complex
Very
study design for a variety of regulatory issues, which, to be perfectly honest with you, for a lot of the conventional crowd that criticize device companies for doing very convoluted trial designs, this is certainly fodder for that. But one of the things that was shown was really there was no real difference in any of the outcomes seen with the use of this device. Now, it was not the perfect application of the device. It seems like the device was moving as judged by the angiographic core lab in a quite substantial proportion of cases. But I think this really sort of increases the impetus for large scale randomized trials like what's going on right now with the Sentinel device, so that people can feel confident that we're actually reducing the rate of stroke with these devices.
There was a little signal there on diffusion weight imaging. I wasn't quite sure how they picked the size to say these are big strokes. You can always pick some cut point. It looked like you might see a little benefit in some of the bigger strokes. But on the other hand, we were talking, Dr. Moses and I, and it's a matter of, do you want to eliminate big holes in Swiss cheese or a lot of little holes in the Swiss cheese? And I got to say, on the drug side, this has been a big issue on the drug side. Are we going to prevent big strokes or a lot of small strokes? And the FDA, and none of us really know which is worse, to have a lot of small little Swiss cheese holes or one big Swiss cheese hole. We just don't know. So the regulatory science is still catching up with the progress on drugs and devices.
And Dave Cohen will tomorrow present results on Sentinel, which we don't know what they're going to show, but this will be in the real world use in TVT. The one caveat, though, I'll say is I personally am not so negative on the field as a whole. And the reason for that is because if the device is safe to use, provided it doesn't cause any adverse events, if it's a family member of yours on the table, and we see this, by the way, with Sentinel, where a lot of sites who don't use it at all of a sudden they have a family member or a VIP or somebody comes in and they start clamoring to get the device to use in that patient. And I don't really like that a lot. I don't think that's how we ought to practice medicine. So we just need to do better studies, and they're tough to do with neurologic ascertainment and the imaging to sort out what exactly is going on. But the good news is those studies are being done.
It does remind you a little bit of distal protection in the coronaries, but I pointed out today in our live session that it's different. With that, you're going across a lesion, and frankly, I think we all knew that when we crossed the lesion with the distal protection device, we caused embolization, at least of the clot. Here, you may not, depending upon where you place the filter, you may not cause some obligate embolization. So I'm more optimistic about this than I was about the protection in coronaries.
Yeah, I would agree with that too.
Yeah, give it some time. I am struck as a pharma guy who does big pharma trials that, the difference in the scale of the trials that are done. So I'm hoping the device side can step it up a little bit in terms of the size and scale of the trials.
The one thing I was talking to Marty earlier today, though, is that sometimes these 300 patient studies with devices and serial MRIs and neurologic follow-up, from terms of cost of the trial, are actually quite substantial compared to more of a conventional just clinical endpoint approach. You can do follow-up visits through phone, et cetera. So there's always that to weigh in consideration too.
Sure, I think that kind of data-rich approach is good in those early iterations where you're trying to get it right, But once you think you've got it right,
Yeah.
Then maybe that's the time to blow it out with, 2-page case report form and lots of patients.
Totally.
Yeah. Well, Ajay, what do we have coming up tomorrow?
I think more trials, more cases. I just want to give a shout out to my my partner and also co-fellow Dimitri Karmpaliotis.
Yeah.
Amazing case he did today. A flush occluded LAD sent to the left main and did it all in an hour, just expertly with imaging guidance. Also Cal Alsawad and the Henry Ford team, a patient who by rights in many places would just be dead, severe shock, and supported with actually a more supportive device, which the patient needed, an Impella 5.0, and did a PCI in that circumstance. So some pretty amazing things, and the cases will continue tomorrow. The trials will continue tomorrow, and we'll keep doing this too. So stay tuned.
I'm awful proud of you for yesterday, Dimitri, who I also trained, and then Alan Jeremias, who presented Define PCI today. It's so great to see your generation doing up and now leading the field.
Well, you trained us. You and Joe and Dave and all the folks, like Lawrence, everybody, Don Cutlip. It's pretty, Dwayne too. So we try to just make you proud. So thanks for saying it.
God bless. All right. Well, thanks for joining us here virtually for TCT 2020. We'll see everybody tomorrow.